Yesterday, Premier Kathleen Wynne told NDP leader Andrea Horwath, "I'm giving you 7 days to tell me whether you'll support my second budget or not." Today, Horwath told the Premier, "I don't need 7 days. I can tell you now," and the answer is no. And with that, we're off to the polls for a provincial general election to be held June the 12th. Joining us now for more on this week's developments, Scott Stinson. He's a columnist with the National Post, and Ashley Chinatti. She is a reporter with QP Briefing, and we're happy to have you here for the first time in a little while.
Thanks,
and we're happy to have you here for the first time since, let me think, last night. Yes, good to see you again. Okay, Ashley, Andrea Horwath had a choice. She could have let the budget pass or vote against it and send us to the polls. She obviously chose the latter, and I want to know why.
I don't think it actually had to do with the contents of the budget itself so much as it did the political environment surrounding the budget. So we've seen a number of scandals creeping up on this Liberal government that has been in power since 2003, although Premier Kathleen Wynne has only been there about 15 months. So I think it was a bit in response to public will that it's time for change, a bit in response to the fact that the minority parliament has been slowly deteriorating. It was never the most functional of places, but it was getting increasingly
hard to get anything passed these days, isn't it?
Anything to get through. And that I think there was an appetite this time, this budget cycle, in the public that wasn't there for the past two budget cycles, because the 2011 election, I don't think people wanted to see the minority government fall too quickly to go into an election that seemed unnecessary. But at this point, I think there was a sense that it was time to go.
The NDP, Scott, had to make a calculus, and they've been obviously discussing this as a caucus for a very long time. Yep. Do we stay or do we go? Yep. And just sort of help us understand some of the issues and things and considerations they may have been weighing.
Well, first of all, they're at a pretty good spot right now. I mean, as of yesterday, they've been influencing two budgets in a row and have really way more weight and pull in the Ontario legislature than they've had since the days when Bob Rae was premier. So they had, they're risking a lot in that sense. They have a good position in a minority parliament in order to affect some change. So they're going into an election now where if Kathleen Wynne wins, then they'll probably not really have the ability to influence her, because she'll say, look, I got a mandate from the people and I'm going to charge ahead. And if Tim Hudak wins, well, now they have basically no way to influence government at all, because it's unlikely to see the NDP working with the Tories in any way, shape or form. So that, I think, is the big thing out there, aside from, every MPP wants to retain his or her job. I think they know that they've had it pretty good. So that's, to my mind, that's the main reason why it's taken this long, despite the fact that the government is sort of scandal-plagued and has different issues. But I think they did get to a point, sort of what Ashley was saying, where they knew they couldn't go through another budget cycle and play the same sort of games they played.
You wrote it this morning in your piece. Yeah. You basically said they have to turn this budget down.
Yeah, and I think you can almost go back to the fact that they didn't really negotiate at all on this budget. Andrea Horwath didn't present the Premier with a list of demands, probably because she knew they would just accept them all. I mean, if she had gone and said, here are the 5 things that I want, my guess would be the Premier would have had reason to accept all of them, because she didn't want an election. And, she presented a budget that was very NDP friendly without the NDP having to ask for anything. So my guess was she would have accepted it, and then Ms. Horwath would have felt obligated to support a budget that had everything in it she asked for. So she didn't ask for it. I think when you look back, that seems now like an indication that all along she was leaning towards not supporting this budget because she made no effort to really influence it.
Well, let me follow up with you on that. How problematic do you think it is for the NDP now to go off into the hustings, or onto the hustings, I should say, saying they would not have been able to vote for a budget that included a pension plan, retirement income security, more taxes on higher income people, and the list goes on, things that the NDP clearly likes?
I think we saw Andrea Horwath trying to address that today in saying we hear a lot of promises, a lot of aspirations from this Liberal government that they don't always tend to follow through on. She gave a couple of examples that some of the Liberals might quibble with, but in this case, I think that will be her attempt at a justification with her base. But I think for the general public, I don't know how many of those budget ideas actually managed to trickle down into the consciousness, and now they're going to become the Liberals' campaign platform. So if Andrea matches them and then says, we're going to promise you this and actually deliver it, or one-up it like she did with the minimum wage, saying they're promising $11 an hour, we're going to promise $12, then perhaps she can get a bit of a justification. I think it also depends on where she is in the province. In very solidly social democratic ridings. Some of her members might have to explain to their constituents, what their reasoning was here, and then list off things that the Liberals haven't followed through on, in the NDP's opinion.
Well, let's pick up on one of those. And again, we don't want to get too much in the weeds here. But for example, last year at the budget negotiations, Andrea Horwath and the NDP said we want the equivalent of the parliamentary budget officer in Ottawa in Ontario. And the Liberals said okay, and so the NDP allowed the budget to pass. Here we are a year later. That office is still not up and rolling. Now there's a difference of opinion as to why it isn't, right? Liberals say it's the NDP's fault, NDP say it's the Liberals' fault. What is the public supposed to make of all of this as a reason why we're now going to the polls?
That's a sign of how dysfunctional the Parliament had gotten. Yeah.
And so we need a clarifying election.
We do.
Okay,
Yeah.
you agree with that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I'll be a cynic for a moment and suggest that the Liberals didn't necessarily really want the Financial Accountability Office to be up and running because it's harder to make a budget. And anytime, they just passed a budget or tried to pass a budget that was full of what I would suggest were some dodgy numbers. And I think the FAO might have had some issues with that. So, whether they were trying their best to get that office up and running, I guess you can take them at their word. They say they wanted to do it.
Well, they said they'd actually named a couple of people to head it, and the NDP and the PCs combined to prevent it.
So, yeah. Now, would they have followed through and actually had that thing going by, this budget cycle? Maybe they would have. I don't know. But, it's at any rate, it's not here. So, as you say, now you go to a campaign and whoever wins will at least have the mandate to kind of get some of these things done quicker.
Unless it's a tie. But let's not think about that just yet. In 1985, it was a tie. I think one of the fascinating things to watch in this campaign is what Labour is going to do, organized Labour. We have already seen, Ashley, yesterday with the budget, the proposed budget. Sid Ryan, the head of the Ontario Federation of Labour, said it was a good budget, the NDP should pass it. Jerry Diaz from Unifor said it's a good budget, there's enough good things in there, we should pass it. Smokey Thomas, right, from OPSU, came out today and had, frankly, the most profanity-laced scrum I've ever seen at Queen's Park. Dropped the F-bomb once, the S-word a couple of times. Fred Hahn from CUPE said the budget ought not to pass either. What's Labour going to do in this election campaign?
Well, I think Smokey Thomas made it very clear today. They're going to support strategically Liberal and NDP candidates to stop Tim Hudak as the Labour-funded Working Families Coalition likes to say. I think we'll see a lot from the Working Families Coalition this election campaign in the form of attack ads towards Tim Hudak, using a lot of his earlier comments on right to work and the RAND formula from earlier this year and late last year. Even though he's tried to back away from that, I think that they will be using that against him very heavily to push a progressive party. I don't think they really care which one, because when it comes down to it at the end of the day, I think both the NDP and the Liberals would be facing the same fiscal situation, would have the same issues with presenting any kind of increases, massive increases for wages for Labour.
Let me push back on you a bit on that. I can't remember, were you guys in that scrum today with Smokey Thomas after Andrea Horwath's thing?
I was, yeah.
You were there?
Yeah.
He called the Premier a liar.
He did, yeah.
He said that he had a deal on pensions with the previous finance minister, and he thought Kathleen Wynne was going to put it in, and she didn't, and she's a liar. This did not sound like a guy who was strategically voting and might support Liberals in certain circumstances.
But he did also explicitly say, when someone asked him where he was going to put his money, where OPSU's money was going to go, he did say he will be putting it into some Liberal members. So maybe he'll be going to the further left Liberal members, or Liberal members that are in seats that are vulnerable to Tories where the NDP might not have a shot. Just anything they can to prevent a Conservative majority. I really think that's going to be the strategy and the only unifying sense we'll see on the left, because I still think some of the teachers' unions have come back into the Liberal fold as well. I think there's some anger still in the base, but I think some of the bigger ones, ETFO's always been...
Elementary teachers.
Elementary teachers have always been a little bit more towards the NDP and have always given their money that way, but the Catholic teachers have for a long time given their money in support to the Liberals, and I think we could see that back.
Smokey Thomas was asked today, Scott, what if your antipathy to this Liberal government, and what if you don't work hard enough for the NDP and you end up getting Tim Hudak, a Conservative majority, how are you going to feel then? And his answer is, well, at least it'll be an enemy we know.
It's funny because I was just thinking of that when Ashley was talking about the strategic voting thing, which is that you do run that risk. If you say, well, we're going to support the Liberals a little here and the NDP a little here, then you end up having the two sort of quote-unquote progressive parties fighting against each other and both doing reasonably well and splitting, say, 60% of the vote, and Tim Hudak comes up over here with 40%, boom, he's got a majority. So, but having said that, I remember interviewing Smokey Thomas maybe a year ago, and he has said he kind of likes Tim Hudak because at least he knows what he's getting. And he, at the time, this was, I think, either right before the Liberal leadership race or right after, the union movement was really upset with Dalton McGuinty because they felt like they knew him, and then he turned around and shivved him with the 2002 budget that threatened to, wage freezes and legislate new contracts and all that stuff. So they've kind of got a bit of a tortured history with the Liberals, and in that sense, I think that might be why you heard the reaction from him today that you did. So. But again, having said all that, the unions are terrified of Tim Hudak, and frankly, for good reason. He's made no bones about the fact that he wants to do a lot of things, some of which I think people would argue are of questionable legality, like whether he could actually do some of the stuff he wants to do. But he's been saying for a long time now that he's willing to fight the union bosses. And so
there may be some votes in that.
Yeah, there may be, and that's the big question, whether that sort of anti-union rhetoric and the unions all lining up against him really works against Tim Hudak in the way I think they hope it will.
Okay. Again, just for the purposes of explaining to our viewers how this stuff actually unfolds, Andrea Horwath has her press conference 10 o'clock this morning saying we're going to vote against the budget. Technically, the House could, as you told us last night, come back, debate the budget, and vote it down. The Premier, Kathleen Wynne, decided, we're not going to do that. I'm just going to the Lieutenant Governor right away, going to ask him to call an election, and here we go. The Liberals had to sort of make a calculation on which was a better way to go. Why did they do what they did?
Well, for the Liberals, this is a great thing for them to have the legislature dissolved now, because on Monday, the Standing Committee on Public Accounts was supposed to be releasing its preliminary investigation report on the Orange Air Ambulance scandal and the misappropriated funds there.
And it will not now?
And it will not come out now because the Parliament has been dissolved by the Lieutenant Governor. The writ won't officially drop until Wednesday, but the Parliament is done. So the next step there, too, was also the gas plants. There was a testimony coming in the Justice Committee on Thursday. We talked about that last night with former McGuinty staffer. So there are some benefits there for them.
And that doesn't happen either.
And that won't happen either, in that those two issues won't be nudged along further by the Parliament. The opposition parties won't get a chance to stand in front of the cameras and again lambast Kathleen Wynne as the successor to Dalton McGuinty and continue that linkage for voters and to continue that narrative. But there are some downsides as well. I mean, there were a number of bills on the order paper that the Liberals would have loved to see pass that are initiatives they've worked on for a long time. But now
Just explain that. All the bills that have been in the pipeline are now dead.
All of them. Yeah.
If they didn't become law,
100 and something of them.
They're dead. For example,
the Child Care Modernization Act, which was written both to overhaul a decades-old piece of legislation, but address the oversight gap that we've heard so many tragedies come from the unlicensed sector over the past year. It was going to tighten up a lot of the rules for daycare in this province. A bill to ban smoking on patios and certain types of flavored tobacco. A bill to bring in ranked balloting in Toronto, which was very popular municipally. A private member's bill from Rosario Marchese and the NDP to remove Toronto from the Ontario Municipal Board. A bill to address the fraud and other issues in the auto insurance industry to help keep bringing down those rates.
We get the, you know your stuff, good for you. Yeah, we get the drift, but the NDP, in making its calculation, miscalculate because they now don't get these moments before those committees to further embarrass the government. These bills, that some of which they liked, are now going to die. Is that a problem?
Well, I think you can always, in an election campaign, say, it's a shame some of these things are gone now, but we as a government would bring them back either in the same form or a better form. I mean, it's an election campaign. You're telling people what you would do in government, so you're basically saying you can't always control when an election's going to be, and so therefore here's our platform and this is what we would do. On the gas plant issue, I mean, the thing that's interesting on that is the committee is dead now. And it's been, I'm not sure when it started. It feels like forever. But we've heard from all kinds of witnesses, many of them over and over, like for multiple appearances. So there are reams and reams of testimony. It's not going to produce a report. I mean, it's finished. But what's interesting is that I kind of think ambiguity works in the opposition's favor on this, because we don't really know what ultimately happened in the whole computer gas plant, email deletion thing that the OPP is investigating. There's no way we're going to hear back from the OPP before this election happens. So there will be no conclusions to be made, which allows both Tim Hudak and Andrea Horwath to raise questions about, well, we don't really know what happened. And the Premier said she wasn't involved, but until we hear back from the OPP, we won't really know. And Mr. Hudak's been careful to not phrase it quite as aggressively as he did immediately following the OPP revelations, which led to the lawsuit. But you can certainly raise questions. It's fair comment to say, we don't actually know what happened and the police are investigating. And that degree of ambiguity, helps on the election campaign. Whereas if there was a report that said, we find X, and Kathleen Wynne was none the wiser about any of it, she'd at least be able to say, look, I was exonerated by this committee.
Right. Okay, a couple of minutes to go here. Liberals, Conservatives, New Democrats, Greens. Who's got the most wind in their sails right now?
Probably, I'm going to go on a limb here and say probably Premier Kathleen Wynne. I think she's been gaining a lot of momentum in the polls, in the public opinion, and I think there were a lot of strong initiatives in this budget. As much as the gas plant scandal has been hanging over Queen's Park, I'm not sure how much it's resonated outside of the bubble, of the political bubble that we all spend so much time in, how much people are actually still worried or enraged about it outside of the circles who pay attention to these things very, very closely. I think people are really worried about getting their sons and daughters jobs, about seeing a retirement future for them. Young people are still very worried about unemployment, about unpaid internships, things that we've seen this Premier at least try to address, but I don't know how much movement there has been there. So I think the momentum is actually surprisingly behind the Liberals.
Scott.
I think the pollsters will always tell you that in a campaign, the key question is not who you're going to vote for, it's do you want to change? And that ultimately that's the first thing that anyone considers. And from there, the sort of electoral calculus figures itself out. I think the biggest thing harming Ms. Wynne is just that this government's been in power a long time. And I know she's newish.
That's her pitch. Her pitch is my safe hands, 15 months. Right. Not Dalton McGuinty's dirty hands, 10 years.
Right, but if she goes out on the campaign trail and tries to claim credit for the achievements of the Liberal government over the previous 10 years, it's very hard to then turn around. Like, you can't say all the good stuff is me and all the bad stuff is not me. And I think that thing, I'm assuming that both opposition parties will do all they can to draw the Dalton McGuinty legacy into this. And then it becomes a question of, they've been in power for a long time and maybe it's time to let somebody else have a crack at it. I tend to think that's where the majority of voters will go. But again, you get into the electoral calculus thing, that might not be the end of the world for Kathleen Wynne, because if everything splits, if lots of people vote for the Conservatives, but a lot of people choose the NDP, the vote for the Time for Change people, then maybe Kathleen Wynne gets a majority of the people who don't want to change, and that allows her to retain power. It all sort of depends how it breaks down at that point.
Well, one thing we know, BC, Alberta, Quebec, those three elections, whatever the poll said going in, were totally irrelevant by the time the campaign was over.
And Ontario the last time.
Last time. And we had a wonderful nerd off last night where you told us about the standing orders and all that stuff. And my nerd off for tonight is election writs are not dropped. Lieutenant Governor David Onley has personally told me the writs are drawn up. So if I ever see in any of your columns, they're dropping the writs over in the LG's office. No, they draw up the writs.
Good to know.
That's our civics lesson for the night. You can thank me later.
Good to know.
Ashley Chinati, it's good to have you here.
Great
Scott,
to be here.
It's nice to have you back here as well from the National Post.
Thanks, Steve.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.